Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah ta'ala, I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to log on. I'm sorry, I'm a couple of minutes late as well. I was having an issue with the internet connection. So, inshallah ta'ala, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about the paper that I released on abortion about a month ago, and I want to give credit first and foremost to Sheikh Muhammad al-Shinawi, Sheikh Hatim al-Hajj, and others that helped put that paper together. And let's see here. And I'll talk about just some of the things about that paper, inshallah, just while I'm waiting for you guys to log on. One of the things that we wanted to do with that paper is we wanted to write it almost independent of the current political discourse surrounding it, while at the same time being relevant to it. And I think that's something that Sheikh Hatim reminded us of as we were putting it together, is that at the end of the day, we're representing the Islamic position on it, the theological position on it, also trying to contrast the Islamic positions within themselves amongst the madhahib, and how they sort of compare, and then also looking at how other faith communities have dealt with this. Now, the reason why I think it's important to always frame it within how other faith communities look at the subject is that it allows us to sort of navigate these waters as a religious community, trying to find out how we can navigate this, how we can actually talk about the subject intelligently, true to our theology, and at the same time, in touch with current realities. So that was the idea of going to the different church positions and some of the Judaic positions. I did have that reviewed by a representative of each one of those traditions that was represented there, so that we don't misrepresent them by something that we're finding online or in journals online. Mostly they were taken from some of their official positions. But to summarize it, what you're talking about with Muslims and how they view this entire debate, first and foremost, contraceptives, you start from an ijtihad perspective, from a perspective of likening. You start with using al-azl, which was withdrawal that the Prophet ﷺ permitted in the hadith of Jabir radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So safe contraceptives. However, at the same time, why a person would engage in that is a different subject altogether. So fear of poverty is something that was prohibited explicitly in the Quran. And we find the Prophet ﷺ and other ahadith encouraging the ummah to have children, and to have as many as they can. And the Prophet ﷺ saying that he would boast about our number on the Day of Judgment as Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ encouraging people to have children, at the same time recognizing that there are different circumstances that take place with people, which perhaps doesn't allow them to have that many children. Or at the end of the day, this is a matter of being something encouraged, but it's not something that's mandated. So the Messenger ﷺ allowing withdrawal in the hadith of Jabir radiallahu ta'ala anhu, while also encouraging people to have many children, sort of explains where this ruling falls in the Sharia, that it falls under the place of that being encouraged. But at the same time, the Messenger ﷺ did prohibit engaging in an action that would permanently not allow you to have children, and that's and that would be purely out of convenience. So, and of course, convenience is a word that needs to be looked into here as well. So there are a lot of terms, as is mentioned in the conclusion, that need to be qualified by a scholar looking at a person's situation, and that individual situation as to when they're allowed to engage in this and when they're allowed to not engage in these things. But safe contraceptives in general are allowed. Then you talk about the timestamps that Islam places on abortion, or that the Muslim scholars traditionally placed on abortion. So you have the 40-day timestamp, and then you have the 120-day timestamp. And those two timestamps, there are a few things that happen or I'm sorry, there are a few things that Islamic scholars debate within those timestamps. Some of the scholars, as we mentioned, particularly from the Maliki school of thought, so you have this variance of opinions in the Maliki school of thought. You have a complete prohibition on anything that would be likened to an abortion or even expelling the semen after intercourse, whatever it may be. And then in the Hanafi madhab, you have an opinion, which would even allow, beyond what most of the scholars would allow, which is a woman to pursue that without the consent of her husband. So that's obviously the mainstream view amongst all those schools of thought falls in between sort of these two positions. And and one of the things that we also take from it is that there's a difference between the need that would allow for an abortion before 40 days and the need that would allow for the abortion after 40 days up until 120 days. So 40 to 120 is different from conception to 40. Conception to 40, essentially a haja, something that's not a dire need, but there is a legitimate reason for it, for that abortion to take place. That's where the scholars generally would allow it. And then after 40 days, it really has to graduate from a haja to a darura, to being a dire need. There has to really be a dire necessity. It has to be a significant cause for that abortion to take place. After 120, as we said, at that point, Islam prioritizes the woman's life. If her life is endangered, then it could be sought out. And if it's a significant danger, and that's, and it's posing a significant risk to her to continue with that pregnancy, or there's fetal demise. So the child has already lost its soul, if you will. The child is already dead at that point. What that means is that with Muslims, that puts us in direct contrast with the Catholic position, for example, which always prioritizes, as I mentioned in the paper, the life of the child over the life of the mother even. So we still prioritize the life of the mother. However, that child at 120 days is a life. It's a human life. And so it needs to be protected. It needs to be taken care of. And it has the rights of a human being at that point. The mother's life, though, is a stable life. So that's why the mother's life, which is more guaranteed, a stable life, protected life, takes precedence over the child's life. But again, if the child was to lose its life if there's fetal demise, obviously at that point, that also would allow for an abortion, and that sort of goes without elaboration. So that sort of gives you guys just a brief spectrum of it, without going into details. Inshallah ta'ala, I'll look forward to your questions. Just finished reading this coincidentally. I always wonder for sure of Islam. So Jazakumullah khairan, Sister Farhana. May Allah reward you. The joy of the fiqh of pregnancy. Yeah, that's actually something I did a long time ago. I should probably do it again. But you could search that online, inshallah ta'ala, the fiqh of pregnancy. That was a 3 or 4 hour seminar that I did a while back, a few years ago. And it sort of just takes you from the beginning of wanting to have children, in fact, marriage, all the way to when the child is born and the rulings of the aqiqah and the rulings of tahniq and things of that sort. Stephen Holloway asked, in Islam, is the scholarly opinion all the same for all madhabs pertaining to abortion? No, absolutely not. There's a wide variance there. So, as I mentioned, there you go from the position within the Maliki madhab, within the Maliki school, which is complete prohibition, to the to what's in the Hanafi school, the opinion that exists in the Hanafi school, which is very lenient in regards to that, particularly with the first timestamp. But no, as I mentioned in the article, there's a lot of variation there. In fact, let me go ahead and post the article in the comment section so that you guys could refer to it, inshallah ta'ala. All right, I accidentally just clicked on a bookmark. There's a great article, by the way, that was published today, Overcoming Pessimism, by Sister Ruhi Tahar. Make sure you guys check that out, inshallah, as well. And here is the paper. There we go. So that's the paper. So one thing I wanted to talk about actually, which I didn't talk about much in the paper, is the political discourse. So while it's coming up, um, it's really interesting because if looking at the state level, and how this subject has been navigated at times with some bipartisan support. Um, you'll note that in some states there is a 20 week ban, meaning post 20 weeks, then abortion um, is not allowed, and that has actually garnered bipartisan support in some states at the state level. So I think late term abortion is the major issue here. Um, Obviously, what complicates the debate, as I sort of mentioned here, is that when you're just talking, when you see it through this binary pro-life, pro-choice, pro-life would sort of conflate, like for example, the Mormon position, which would even prohibit contraceptives and prohibit abortion from the very beginning, regardless of circumstance, all the way to, um, the most lenient Lutheran position. So that's sort of where the problem becomes there. And obviously, with pro-choice, though, there could be an indication of the complete unrestricted right of the mother to abort a pregnancy, no matter what, to sort of remove any type of prohibition there. And I believe that as Muslims, we always sort of need to push for, a more balanced view of these things, because in our view, obviously, the child after 120 days is like a human being, so it has rights and it should be protected, with the mother's life still maintaining precedence. And I think that that's a view that many Democrats even, and many, maybe not many, but a significant amount of Democrats would even believe in the problem of late term abortions. So that does become an issue, and I think that as Muslims we can always sort of push for this balanced platform. Yesterday I was actually at UT Southwestern, with all the with the mental health residents in particular, but we were actually discussing the subject. And subhanAllah, every time we sort of talk about the Islamic position, it's viewed with a lot of regard by people in this space, because it is a very balanced view in its nature. It's not black and white in Islam. It's not black and white in our jurisprudence, in our rich jurisprudence. And we can push for a balanced position on these things. And obviously, one of the things making contraceptives available to people in low-income neighborhoods and people that would not have access to that. That's also part of it. And then also what we're talking about from a moral perspective, advocating for abstinence or celibacy. There's also room for that, and that's something that I also tried to point out in the article, that you'll have conservatives that are sort of compassionate conservatives that would still talk about sexual ethics and talk about celibacy and abstinence education, but at the same time they would show some sort of nuance in the discussion of contraceptives and abortion that Islam would talk about. Okay, so that's a really good question. Medically wise, they're finding that the baby is breathing earlier than we thought within the first 6 weeks, so wouldn't 40 days be a little late? That's sort of why I pointed out to the difference between embryogenesis, which is known as takhalluq in Islamic jurisprudence, and the soul. So the child breathing before that time doesn't necessarily mean that the soul is there, because the soul is one of the mysteries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. So the heart beating does not recognize that the soul is actually there. The one other thing to note is that when Muslim scholars talked about this in the past, they spoke about it mainly from an approximate perspective. They spoke about numbers in the approximate sense. So you're not able to, even today with all the technology that we have, right, it's hard to determine when exactly a child is conceived. So this is, there's no contradiction between the two, because when we talk about the soul coming in, that's just a short answer. The soul coming in, we're not talking about takhalluq or embryogenesis, and it's not going to be a contradiction between the two, because the soul is from from the matters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ghaib, from the matters of the unseen. Is there a program you'd you would recommend for Muslims with little knowledge in Islam? YaqeenInstitute.org. um, YaqeenInstitute.org. So what I mean by that, though, we're trying to address a very specific part of Islamic thoughts, things that are being claimed and things that are being used against the Muslim community, things that are causing doubt in the Muslim community, and things that are also causing an identity crisis of sorts. But if you're talking about organized programs and learning programs, mashallah, there are a lot of platforms that are out there. And if I recommend one, that I'd probably upset the others. But make dua for us, inshallah. Asadullah, one of our fellows. The pro-life position is very tenuous when considering that the majority of abortions are not for health concerns or due to rape, but merely for convenience. The pro-choice position. Jordan Duffner. Jordan, it's good to have you, Jordan, from Bridge Initiative. Thank you so much for this. Really important for my fellow Catholics to have more awareness on the Islamic positions. Thank you, Jordan, for tuning in. So 120 days, is that, I don't really understand that question. More likely than 40. Yeah, I don't understand the question there. Anyone else? Am I missing any questions here? I can't tell if I am. So what Asadullah, what you're mentioning about the pro-choice position being very tenuous, I think that even the word convenience has issues, though, because when you're talking about convenience, or you're talking about what the word convenience means, it goes beyond health concerns in the Sharia. Especially when you're talking about that pre-40 day or that very early termination or contraceptives. So I think that word is debatable and what convenience means. Definitely, I think once it gets between the 40 and the 120, it's pretty much exclusively into health concerns at that point, for sure. And after 120, the health concerns of the mother in particular. But yeah, I think that's the statistics around that are debatable, and I do believe fully that as Muslims, we don't identify with either platform on this. It's very tough to, for the reasons that are mentioned in the conclusion of the article. Okay, what is the difference between the hajat of the 40 days and the darurat before 120? And then what does Islam say about life support? Because I see, Ozair, you asked your question first on Islam. What does Islam say about life support? There are a lot of great fatwa on that from Dr. Hatim al-Hajj, who's obviously one of our scholars, my teacher as well, who helped on this. And he has the advantage of being a physician as well as a PhD in fiqh. Life support is permissible. It's recommended when there is a chance of a person actually coming back. But what the recent fiqh councils have judged is that brain death does actually equate to death. So at that point, to leave someone in that state of life support is not recommended, because brain death would actually equal death. That was the latest fatwa, the last fatwa on that issue from most of the jurisprudence bodies, including the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. And it's a difficult decision that everyone has to make. And it's not a black and white decision when it comes to life support, because you could have different doctors saying different things. So some of the fiqh bodies would require 2 or 3 doctors or Muslim doctors to analyze the situation and then to pass a judgment on whether or not the life support should stay. So there's a difference between unlikely and no chance of survival, right, in medical terms. And obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala controls everything. So sometimes even when a person could be ruled as having no chance, they come back. And we've seen that happen, but that is taken into consideration at that point. The difference between the hajat before 40 days and darurat before 120 days. Primarily just sort of what I just mentioned with Asadullah's comment, that after 40 days it becomes almost exclusively health concerns, if not exclusively health concerns. Whereas before 40 days it's not exclusively health concerns. So there has to be a significant health risk to the mother, to the fetus, between the 40 days and the 120 days. All right, guys, so it is 11:28. I'm just seeing if there's any more questions. How does one who is unfamiliar with schools of thought approach all these different opinions of abortion without resorting to fatwa shopping? Well, I think that, generally speaking, as you know, this is just the general rule. This becomes a longer discussion about, you know, fatwa shopping and what it means to follow a school of thought. But at the end of the day, it's what's mentioned in the Hashiyah by Zayn al-Abidin, that the madhab of the Ami, the madhab of the layperson, is the madhab of the mufti, is the madhab of the scholar that he goes to. So going to a trusted scholar on all of these affairs, who comes from a consistent background, is healthy for your iman. But when a person finds himself in haraj or liq, in a significant hardship, then taking the established opinion of another madhab is not fatwa shopping to get themselves out of a hardship. So that's a good question, but I would say that that's where you go to the same trusted scholar or group of scholars that come from a single maslak. All right, so Asadullah, might there be an argument for the fact that sexual ethics seem very loose in secular, materialistic societies? So when I mention convenience, I mean to say that it seems like pregnancy in and of itself is a mere annoyance that can be done away with because the child is not a child, or the mother has ownership of her own body, so understanding that the fetus within a certain time period is not a human and thus not afforded rights. Isn't there still an issue here regarding such apathy to responsibility and the formation of life? No, yeah, so look, treating early pregnancy like it is a cold or a pimple is definitely not what we're talking about. And I do think that it's important to recognize that hearing from people that have been in that experience and that have been through that experience, and taking fact-based analysis of when people resort to, or what causes people to resort to abortion, is important here. I don't think that many, and just being in the capacity of an imam, when you deal with sisters that come to you with this situation all the time, and I think if you spoke to most imams that deal with sisters that come in this situations, it's not a candy shop, right? It's not like, oh, well, I think I'm not feeling it yet, so I'm gonna go dump it. It's not an easy decision. But I think what you're saying, that everything has to be analyzed within the bigger paradigm. Of course, there's no doubt about it. Which is why I point out, we pointed out in the paper about sexual ethics and the role of sexual ethics. So the idea is that you represent the Islamic position. And then once you have the Islamic position, then at the end of the day, it's not a one-size-fits-all topic. Most things in fiqh aren't, especially when you're talking about something of this seriousness. Wallahu ta'ala alam. All right, jazakumullah khairan everyone for tuning in. Subhanallah wa hamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
beat steady like the ocean tide. Secrets linger in the breeze. In this moment, worlds collide. Feel the rhythm set you free.